In the early months of 1942, the Japanese merchant marine felt a strange sense of invulnerability. They were sailing through waters infested with American submarines. They saw the periscopes. They saw the bubble trails of the torpedoes approaching. But they didn't fear them. Japanese captains reported a bizarre phenomenon. An American torpedo would strike the side of their ship with a loud metallic clang. The ship would shudder. The crew would brace for the explosion. And then, nothing. The torpedo would simply bounce off the steel hull, dented and useless, and sink to the bottom of the ocean. Or, the torpedo would run deep, passing harmlessly under the keel. Or it would explode prematurely, 50 yards away, splashing water on the deck but doing no damage. This led to a dangerous complacency among the Japanese commanders. They began to view the American submarine force as incompetent. They mocked the Yankee technology. They stopped zigzagging. They sailed with their lights on. They felt that the Emperor's protection was shielding them from the enemy's fire. On the bridge of a Japanese tanker, the captain would watch a white wake streak toward his ship. He wouldn't even turn the wheel. He would wait for the thud. Then he would laugh. Another American dud, he would say. "They are firing logs at us." This mockery was a bitter pill for the American submarine crews. Inside the humid, foul-smelling hulls of the Gato and Tambor-class boats, the mood was murderous. The captains were risking their lives to get into perfect firing positions. They were penetrating destroyer screens. They were lining up shots at point-blank range. They would fire a spread of 4 torpedoes. They would listen on the sonar for the boom. Instead, they heard the sickening sound of metal hitting metal, followed by silence. They watched through the periscope as their targets sailed away, unharmed, signaling their position to the Japanese destroyers who would then hunt the submarine down with depth charges. The American sailors weren't being defeated by the enemy. They were being defeated by their own ammunition. They were fighting a war with a weapon that refused to work, against an enemy that was laughing at them. The weapon at the heart of this failure was the Mark 14 steam torpedo. On paper, it was a masterpiece of engineering. It was developed in the 1930s at the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island. It cost $10,000 apiece, a staggering sum in the Depression era. It was fast. It had a long range. And it carried a secret weapon in its nose, the Mark 6 exploder. This device was supposed to be the ultimate ship killer. It used a magnetic influence sensor. The idea was that the torpedo would run under the enemy ship. The sensor would detect the change in the magnetic field caused by the massive steel hull of the target. It would detonate the warhead directly beneath the keel. The explosion would create a gas bubble that would lift the ship out of the water and break its back. It was a theory that promised one-hit kills on battleships and cruisers. The engineers at Newport were so proud of their creation that they treated it like a crown jewel. But there was a problem. A massive, unforgivable problem. Because the torpedoes were so expensive, the Navy refused to test them with live warheads. They fired them with concrete practice heads. They retrieved them, polished them, and put them back on the shelf. They assumed the magnetic exploder worked because the math said it should. They assumed the depth control worked because the gauges said so. They built a gold-plated weapon in a laboratory vacuum, untouched by the reality of the ocean. When the war started, the Mark 14 was issued to the fleet as the wonder weapon. The submarine crews treated them with reverence. They polished them. They maintained them. They didn't know they were loading their tubes with defective junk. They didn't know that the wonder weapon had never actually sunk a ship in a test. They were about to find out the hard way, in the shark-infested waters of the Pacific, that a $10,000 price tag doesn't guarantee a bang. As the reports of failures began to flood in from the Pacific, the submarine commanders expected a quick fix. They radioed Pearl Harbor, torpedoes running deep. Torpedoes failing to explode. Hit enemy cruiser, no detonation. They expected the Navy to send engineers. To send new weapons. Instead, they got a reprimand. The Bureau of Ordnance, BUORD, in Washington, D.C., was run by the Gun Club, a clique of officers who had designed the Mark 14. To them, the torpedo was perfect. Therefore, if it missed, it must be the fault of the men firing it. The Bureau issued scathing responses to the combat reports. The submarine commanders are inept, they claimed. They are miscalculating the range. They are setting the depth wrong. They are making excuses for their own poor shooting. It was a classic case of bureaucratic gaslighting. The men in the air-conditioned offices of Washington were telling the men sweating and dying in the Pacific that they didn't know how to do their jobs. Admiral Ralph Christie, the torpedo expert in Australia, sided with the Bureau. He had helped design the magnetic exploder. He refused to believe it was flawed. He ordered his captains to keep using the magnetic setting. He threatened to relieve anyone who disabled it. This arrogance cost thousands of lives. Submarines were lost because they stayed in the area too long, trying to get a torpedo to work, until the Japanese destroyers found them. Captains who were aggressive and skilled, men who should have been aces, were sent home in disgrace, their careers ruined by misses that were actually perfect hits with bad bullets. The disconnect was absolute. The Bureau pointed to their blueprints. The captains pointed to the enemy ships still afloat. The Japanese commanders, observing the lack of explosions, concluded that the American spirit was weak. They didn't know that the American spirit was furious. The submarine crews began to hate the Bureau of Ordnance almost as much as they hated the Japanese. They realized they were fighting a two-front war, one against the Imperial Navy, and one against their own supply chain. The first major flaw to be exposed was the magnetic exploder. The theory was brilliant. The reality was physics. The Earth's magnetic field varies depending on where you are. It is different in Newport, Rhode Island, than it is in the Solomon Islands. The Mark 6 exploder had been tested in New England. It had never been tested near the equator. In the tropical waters of the Pacific, the magnetic variations caused the exploders to go haywire. Torpedoes would explode 50 yards from the target. Or, they would pass directly under the keel and fail to detonate at all. The captains pleaded to disable the magnetic feature. They wanted to switch to simple contact fuses, hit the ship, blow up. The Bureau refused. The magnetic feature is our advantage, they insisted. You just aren't using it right. It became a battle of wills. Captains began to disobey orders. In the privacy of the torpedo rooms, away from the prying eyes of the Admirals' staff, they ordered their torpedo men to disable the magnetic influence mechanism. They wanted to hit the ship in the side. A contact hit. But this revealed the second, even crueler flaw. The torpedoes were running deep. When a captain set the depth for 10 feet to hit the side of a destroyer, the torpedo would actually run at 20 or 25 feet. It would pass harmlessly under the hull. The Bureau denied this too. They claimed their depth sensors were calibrated perfectly. The Japanese captains must have wondered why the Americans were trying to shoot the fish under their ships. They would see the wake pass under their stern. They would laugh. The Americans cannot aim, they said. This magnetic lie protected the Japanese fleet for nearly 18 months. Carriers that should have been sunk survived. Troop transports that should have been destroyed delivered their soldiers to islands like Guadalcanal and Tarawa. American soldiers died on the beaches because the submarines failed to stop the reinforcements at sea. The blood was on the hands of the Bureau. But the submarine commanders were done asking for permission. They were about to take matters into their own hands and prove, with undeniable physical evidence, that the Emperor had no clothes and the Bureau had no brain. By mid-1942, Admiral Charles Lockwood, the new commander of the submarine force in Australia, had heard enough excuses from Washington. He was a sailor's admiral. He listened to his men. And his men told him the torpedoes were running deep. The Bureau of Ordnance insisted that the depth mechanisms were perfect. They claimed the crews were simply bad at math. Lockwood decided to prove them wrong with a test that was so simple it was undeniable. He went to Frenchman's Bay in Australia. He ordered a submarine, the USS Skipjack, to fire a live torpedo with a dummy warhead at a fishing net. The net was strung across the bay. It was marked with depth indicators. The Skipjack fired. The torpedo was set to run at 10 feet. The crew watched as the torpedo pierced the net. They rowed out to measure the hole. The hole was at 21 feet. The torpedo had run 11 feet deeper than set. Against a Japanese destroyer with a draft of 12 feet, that torpedo would have passed harmlessly underneath. Lockwood was furious. He had proof. He sent the data to Washington. The Bureau tried to argue that the test was flawed because the torpedo was a dummy lighter than a war shot. Lockwood ran the test again with a war shot. The result was the same. It turned out the Bureau had calibrated the depth sensors based on the weight of the torpedo without the warhead attached. It was a schoolboy error. Because the warhead made the torpedo heavier in the nose, it dove deeper to maintain trim. The perfect weapon had been calibrated for a configuration that would never be used in combat. This revelation was the first crack in the Bureau's armor. Lockwood ordered his captains to set their torpedoes to run shallow, sometimes at 0 depth, to compensate for the error. The fishing net test saved the submarine force. It proved that the problem wasn't the men, it was the machine. But fixing the depth was only half the battle. The contact exploder was still a mystery. In July 1943, the USS Tinosa, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Dan Daspit, encountered the target of a lifetime. The Tonan Maroon No. 3. It was a 19,000-ton Japanese whale factory ship, a massive floating industrial plant. The Tinosa had already damaged it, stopping its engines. The huge ship sat dead in the water, a sitting duck. It was the perfect laboratory test. Daspit maneuvered his submarine into the perfect firing position. 875 yards range. 90-degree angle, broadside. He fired a torpedo. Clang. A splash of water at the side of the ship. No explosion. Daspit checked his settings. He fired again. Clang. He fired again. And again. And again. He fired 15 torpedoes. He watched through the periscope as they hit the steel hull of the tanker. He saw the splashes. He heard the impacts. Not one of them detonated. It was a nightmare. The crew was in despair. They were wasting their entire loadout on a defenseless target and achieving nothing. Finally, Daspit fired his last torpedo from a sharp angle, not 90 degrees, but an oblique angle. Boom! It exploded. Daspit realized the terrifying truth. The contact exploder only worked if it hit at a bad angle. If it hit perfectly square, the ideal shot, it failed. He returned to Pearl Harbor with the last torpedo still in the tube. He marched into Admiral Lockwood's office. "I am not going back out there," he reportedly said, "until you give me something that explodes." The Tinosa incident was the smoking gun. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the contact exploder was defective. It forced the Bureau to stop blaming the captains and start looking at the firing pin. The Japanese crew of the Tonan Maru must have thought they were blessed by the gods. They had survived a firing squad because the bullets were made of rubber. Admiral Lockwood was done with Washington. He decided to fix the contact exploder himself, in Hawaii. He ordered his engineers to take the warheads apart. They found the culprit, the firing pin mechanism. It was a heavy, complex assembly. When the torpedo hit a ship at a perfect 90-degree angle, the deceleration was massive. The heavy firing pin had too much inertia. Instead of sliding forward to strike the primer, the friction caused it to bind in its guides. It jammed. It was a design flaw that could only be discovered by hitting something hard. The Bureau had never tested it against steel plate. Lockwood ordered a drop test. His men hoisted a warhead, filled with concrete to simulate the explosive weight, 90 feet up a cliff in Hawaii. Below, they placed a steel plate from a scrapped ship. They dropped the warhead nose first onto the plate. 70% of the time, the firing pin failed to fire. It was proof positive. The Bureau of Ordnance was humiliated. Their perfect mechanism was a dud. The fix was incredibly simple. They needed to make the firing pin lighter so it wouldn't bind. They also needed to change the way it struck the primer. The engineers at Pearl Harbor didn't wait for a factory redesign. They went to the machine shops. They were about to perform surgery on the most complex weapon in the Navy using hand tools. The solution to the gold-plated dud came from a piece of enemy wreckage. The engineers realized the heavy steel firing pin was the problem. They needed a lighter material. They found the propeller of a Japanese Zero fighter plane that had been shot down during the Pearl Harbor attack, or later in the war. It was made of high-grade aluminum alloy. Light. Strong. The machinists in the submarine base workshops took the Japanese propeller and melted it down, or machined pieces from it. They turned new, lightweight firing pins on their lathes. They installed these aluminum pins into the Mark 14 warheads. Then they did the drop test again. It worked every time. The lighter pin didn't bind. It struck the primer with enough force to detonate the warhead, even at a perfect 90-degree impact. It was a supreme irony. The weapon that would destroy the Japanese merchant marine was fixed using metal scavenged from a Japanese airplane. The Pearl Harbor propeller fix was distributed to the fleet immediately. Mechanics worked around the clock to retrofit the torpedoes in the submarines. By late 1943, the Mark 14 was finally a working weapon. It ran at the right depth, thanks to the net test. It exploded on contact, thanks to the aluminum pin. The American submarine captains, who had been fighting with one hand tied behind their backs for 2 years, were finally unleashed. They had a weapon that worked. And they had a lot of pent-up anger to use it with. The Japanese commanders, who had grown complacent, who had stopped zigzagging, who had laughed at the duds, were about to face a rude awakening. The white snake had grown fangs. By early 1944, the Mark 14 torpedo was fixed. And the Pacific Ocean changed from a hunting ground into a slaughterhouse. The Japanese merchant fleet was already stretched thin. Now, the ships started to disappear at an alarming rate. The American submarine captains, finally armed with a reliable weapon, tore into the Japanese convoys with a vengeance. The days of the clang were over. When a white wake was spotted now, it wasn't a joke. It was a death sentence. Captain Red Ramage of the USS Parche conducted an attack so ferocious that he was awarded the Medal of Honor. He surfaced his submarine in the middle of a Japanese convoy at night. For 45 minutes, he zigzagged through the enemy ships, firing torpedoes from both the bow and stern tubes. Ships exploded around him. Tankers turned into towering infernos. Transports broke in half. The Japanese destroyers were chaotic, firing their guns wildly in the dark, sometimes hitting their own ships. Ramage sank 2 ships and damaged 3 others before slipping away. This became the new normal. The Japanese captains who had stopped zigzagging paid the ultimate price for their arrogance. The invincible tankers of 1942 were now vulnerable targets. The American crews felt a grim satisfaction. They were finally doing the job they were trained to do. The ocean floor began to litter with the steel hulls of the Japanese Empire, all sent there by a weapon that had been rescued from bureaucratic incompetence by the sailors themselves. With reliable torpedoes, the U.S. Navy changed its tactics. They stopped sending submarines out alone. They adopted the German tactic of the Wolfpack. 3 or 4 American submarines would hunt together, coordinated by radio. They would locate a Japanese convoy. One submarine would attack from the left, another from the right, and a third from ahead. The Japanese escorts were overwhelmed. They couldn't hunt 3 submarines at once. While a destroyer was chasing one submarine deep, the other 2 would surface and massacre the merchant ships. The Wolfpacks, with names like Blair's Blasters and Donk's Devils, decimated the remaining Japanese shipping. The statistics were staggering. In 1942, with defective torpedoes, U.S. submarines sank about 800,000 tons of shipping. In 1944, with fixed torpedoes and Wolfpack tactics, they sank nearly 2.5 million tons. The Japanese convoy system collapsed. They didn't have enough destroyers to protect their ships, and they didn't have enough ships left to protect. The white snake had become a hydra. Cut off one head, and two more attacked. The Japanese Navy, which had prided itself on its own torpedo prowess, the Long Lance, was being beaten at its own game. They were being strangled by a weapon that, just 2 years earlier, they had laughed at. The most significant impact of the fixed torpedo wasn't military, it was economic. Japan was an island nation. It had almost no natural resources. It imported 90% of its oil, its iron ore, and its rice. The U.S. submarine campaign became a starvation blockade. Tankers from the Dutch East Indies, carrying the lifeblood of the Imperial Navy, were sunk before they could reach Japan. Ships carrying bauxite, for aluminum to build planes, were sent to the bottom. Ships carrying soldiers to reinforce islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa were intercepted and destroyed. By 1945, the Japanese economy was strangling. Factories were idle for lack of raw materials. The mighty battleships of the fleet, including the Yamato, were trapped in port because they had no fuel to sail. Civilians in Tokyo were starving, living on rations of sawdust and acorns. The war industry ground to a halt. American aerial surveys of Japanese ports in 1945 showed harbors that were empty of merchant ships. The docks were still. The cranes were silent. The Mark 14 torpedo had done what no army could do. It had cut the throat of the Japanese Empire. The arrogance of the Japanese leaders, who believed they could fight a modern war without a secure supply line, proved fatal. They had bet everything on the decisive battles between fleets, ignoring the slow, silent war of attrition that was bleeding them dry. When the war ended in August 1945, the U.S. Navy submarine force returned to Pearl Harbor in triumph. Their decks were lined with empty brass shell casings. Their battle flags were covered with symbols of sunken Japanese ships. Some submarines returned with a broom tied to their periscope, the sign of a clean sweep, sinking every ship in a convoy. The submarine force represented less than 2% of the U.S. Navy's personnel. Yet, they were responsible for sinking 55% of all Japanese ships lost during the war, both merchant and military. They had achieved a level of destruction that is unmatched in naval history. And they had done it despite their own bureaucracy. The Mark 14 torpedo scandal remains a case study in institutional failure. It showed how arrogance, groupthink, and a refusal to listen to the men in the field can almost lose a war. The Bureau of Ordnance never fully admitted its mistakes. They tried to cover up the scandal for years. But the sailors knew the truth. They knew that the victory in the Pacific was a silent victory. It was won not just by fighting the Japanese, but by fighting for a weapon that worked. It was won by Admiral Lockwood, by the crew of the Tinosa, and by the anonymous machinists who turned a piece of Japanese aluminum into the firing pin that broke the back of the empire. The Japanese admirals who had laughed in 1942 were now signing surrender documents on the deck of an American battleship, their nation destroyed by the weapon they had once mocked as a dud.